NSO broadcast down right now.
Now the first tank that's come into the arena is the infantry tank Mk.1, otherwise known as the A11. It was also known as the Matilda, and you're going to say, well, that's a bit odd, it doesn't look like the Matilda I'm used to, which is a much bigger tank. Well, there were two Matildas, and this was the first of them. The story is that, having seen it running, General Ellis said it reminded him of the comic duck Matilda, but since no one's ever heard of the comic duck Matilda, we think it's more likely to be a code name issued by Vickers Armstrong. Matilda, after all, means valiant in battle in the old lexicon of name meanings. This tank was very small. It was a type used in France in 1940 by 4th and 7th Royal Tank Regiments. It has a crew of 2 and is armed with a single Vickers machine gun in the rotating turret. It had the merit of being very thickly armoured for its day and having a quite reliable 4V8 engine in it which kept it going, but apart from that it really was a travesty of a tank. Far too small to be effective, the gun of no real value at all. Just scratching paint off other tanks, really. And they were used briefly during the early battles in France, and particularly at the Battle of Arras in April 1940, when for a while they just sort of put Rommel's back up and rather shook him. But they were only a very light tank by comparison with what came later, and very archaic looking with those exposed tracks and the suspension sticking out by that. Now the next tank coming in is the Valentine. The Valentine's another example of a tank with a strange name. People say it was because it was ordered on Valentine's Day, which it wasn't. And also that Valentine was the middle name of John Carden, the designer, which it was, but John Carden didn't use the name, so again, it's presumably a code name developed by Vickers. Valentine derives from valens in Latin, which can be translated as valor. Now, when the Valentine was first delivered, it mounted a 40mm or 2-pounder gun, but Vickers Armstrongs kept it in production for most of the war. As the war went on, they gradually outgunned it, so our version is fitted with the 57mm 6-pounder gun, and the very last one actually had a 75. Really, by then, the tank was getting a bit long in the tooth. It was not able to keep up with modern tanks. But in its day, it had quite a good reputation, and was particularly famous for use in the desert. They were built in their thousands, and also by the Canadians. Most of those tanks built for the Canadians, or by the Canadians, were sent to Russia and used by the Russian tank people, who seemed to like them. They weren't a patch on what they had themselves, but the tank was reliable. It's powered by a General Motors diesel engine, and was much more reliable, probably, than most British tanks of that period. It carries a crew of 3, that's a driver, a gunner and a commander, but the commander was also the loader, that was his other duty. So it is quite a famous tank in many ways, and it's just going to go off, and it's being replaced by the M3 Stuart. Now the Stuart was the first American tank used by the British Army in the desert in 1942. Usually powered by a radial aircraft engine, so it was quite powerful, but it had a layout which wasn't really suitable for the British crews. The original version didn't have a turret basket, so you had to run round as you traverses the turret. And there's a great shaft running down the middle of the tank, because if you compare American tanks with the British, you'll find the Americans went for a layout of having the engine in the back and the transmission at the front, which is all right. But it means you've got to have a drive shaft connecting the two, and if that splits the the crew compartment in half, then it's a bit of a nuisance. Very boxy, upright tank. It was built as a reconnaissance vehicle in for the American Army. We used them originally as light cruiser tanks because the 37mm gun on the Stuart was as effective as our 2-pounder, or near enough, so there really wasn't much to choose. But later on they were used by the British as reconnaissance vehicles, and particularly without the turrets. We used to lift the turrets off and run them as glorified Brennan carriers, really. And really for reconnaissance, armed with only a machine gun, that's all you need. The reconnaissance vehicle shouldn't be out there fighting. It should be gathering information, reporting back, and that's what they did. This version, which is the M3A1, has the cast turrets, the rounded sort of turret. The early ones had an angular riveted or welded turret. So it's a slightly more progressive tank than the early models. And some of them are still in use in France in 1944, although really they've been outclassed then by more modern tanks, especially the M5 series Stuarts and the M24 Chaffee, which replaced them. But they were built in large numbers. They were used also by the Australians in the Pacific, and by, well, the Russians used them, and by the Chinese at different times. So they had a lot of use all around the world. But they were rather limited when it came to fighting the modern German stuff. That was the big trouble. They're fast and very nippy and reliable, and those things were really the things that counted for the tank, compared with its rather thin armour and boxy shape, which counted against it. He's just going off, and with a bit of luck should be replaced, I think, if my list isn't lying, by a Panzer III. Have a look. Yeah, see. Huh. Well, the Panzer III, I think it's coming out now. It's going to lead our small German contingent around. Now, the Panzer III is typical of the earlier German tanks of the Second World War, but they're all very similar in basic outline, very boxy shaped, very square fronted. The other thing about all German tanks, which most people get wrong, they were powered by a Maybach V12 water-cooled petrol engine, not by diesel engines. The Germans never used diesels in any of their tanks. The Panzer III has torsion bar suspension, which means you've got bars running across the floor of the tank which twist to act as a springing motion. And like the American tank we just looked at, you have a rear engine and front transmission. So the drive sprocket, which is the geared wheel that actually drags the tank along its tracks, is at the front rather than the back. The tanks are all welded construction, and with the Panzer III it was designed to mount a 37mm gun. Quite early in the Desert War, they upgunned it to take a 50mm gun, and later on a long 50mm gun, which kept it abreast of what everyone else was doing. By the end of its career, it had reverted to a very short 75mm gun. So it was possible to continue upgunning the tank, first of all without disturbing its performance, and more important still, without having to get rid of the crew. Mostly when you put a bigger gun in a tank, you have to throw a member of the crew out to make room. This tank, the Panzer III, has a crew of 5. That will be 3 in the turret and 2 in the front of the hull. The driver on the left, and beside him the hull machine gunner radio operator, who sits on the right there. As I said, all of welded construction, and if you look at this tank closely, if you go up and see it when it's parked up, you'll see that it's had extra armour added on. It's another thing the Germans weren't afraid of, was sticking extra armour on the vehicles when they needed it. And following the Panzer III is a thing called a Kettenkrad, a kleiner Kettenkrad. It's effectively a half-tracked motorcycle. It's got front forks and a single wheel like a motorbike, but the rest of it is a very small tracked vehicle. Again, it uses torsion bar suspension with interleaved wheels. They were designed originally for the paratroops, to give them an air-portable vehicle which would tow an anti-tank gun. But they tended to be used in conditions where the ground was awful and where they'd run better than a wheeled vehicle. You have a one-man driver who sits at the front there and controls it by the handlebars and by the ordinary gearbox, and then two other men sitting behind him facing the other way. And they really were very popular. The very odd thing about them is the massive expense they went to in constructing them. Even the tracks have got roller bearings on, which must cost a fortune. And they did this with a lot of their half tracks, and you wonder sometimes whether it was really worth it or not. It's built on a no expense fare basis. The third vehicle in that column is another German classic. It's the Volkswagen Kübelwagen, which is effectively the German Jeep. Although it wasn't four-wheel drive, it would still go pretty well anywhere. Underneath the sort of rather utilitarian body, there is a Volkswagen engine, Volkswagen transmission, exactly the same as the Beetle. But they were used as field cars by the German army in much the same way as the Americans and ourselves used the Jeep. And really their performance, considering their only two-wheel drive, is quite remarkable. They could cope with most sort of conditions, from the mud and snow of Russia to the sands of the desert, and of course northwest Europe, and they were used quite extensively by the German armed forces. So that gives you a sample of some of the German vehicles that we've got. We're about to show you something a bit more impressive, but they're a good example, those three, of what the Germans actually used in fairly large numbers. The Panzer III and the slightly larger Panzer IV. This has been a remarkable and very expensive restoration job carried out by the local workshops on behalf of the Tank Museum, and it has restored a Tiger I to virtually original condition. Like the earlier tanks, it's powered by a Maybach V12 petrol engine, driving to an 8-speed pre-selector gearbox at the front. The suspension is still torsion bar, but rather than individual wheels, you find they've got interleaved and overlapping wheels. The reason being they had a lot of weight. This tank weighed about 56 tons, with 100 millimeters of frontal armour, and you needed that extra rubber in contact with the track to spread the weight comfortably as it was going on. Another thing with the Tiger was that it was so wide it wouldn't fit onto an ordinary railway wagon. So if you wanted to move that tank by rail, and it was really the only way of moving the tank from A to B, you had to take off the outer set of wheels, take off the tin plate that runs down the sides, and put on narrower tracks or travelling tracks, because it wouldn't go on the train with its ordinary tracks on, and that was a right chore to do at the end of every day. You had to take it off the train, put the wider tracks and the wheels back on before it could go into battle. It's armed with an 88mm gun, which is a derivative of the anti-aircraft gun that was so famous in the German army as their anti-tank weapon. And you can understand, I think, if you look at the Tiger, why so many Allied tank crews were nervous of it. They had need to be, because that was a powerful tank and the gun was supremely accurate, and it could take out any tank that we had at ranges that we simply couldn't reply to. So you had to get suicidally close to a Tiger to even scratch the paint on it, and you usually got clobbered before then. Otherwise, the Tiger was, the only odd thing about them, despite their immense power, was that the Germans only built about 1,300 of them. So what you're seeing is a rare sight in any case. It's getting a bit of a move on now, which is about as much as it can do in this arena. All welded construction again, same 5-man crew, driver, hull machine gunner come radio operator, and 3 men in the turret, the commander, the gunner and the loader, all required to keep the tank in action. You had to be very careful with the Tiger. The Tiger was a bit sensitive in its transmission, and Tiger commanders were forbidden to tow another Tiger tank in trouble out of trouble. If you did that, you were liable to wreck the gearbox on your own tank. And there's a famous incident in Italy where they tried this and lost so many tanks they nearly wiped out a battalion without getting involved with the enemy at all. But the Tiger was and is a very impressive vehicle. and well worth seeing just to have it trundle around the arena. And he's running very well today. There he goes, trundling off. You can go and look at them later on when the but I would warn you, if you're going to look at those tanks in there, beware of ones that have been running recently. They can get a bit hot, and don't sit little Jimmy on the exhaust pipe or he'll yell. They can really best to wait until they've cooled down a bit. The other thing I should say is never stand behind a tank with its engine running. They won't normally move without checking the area, but the driver can't see you, and he really does need to have some clear space around him to manoeuvre. Now the next thing coming on isn't a tank, it's actually an anti-tank gun drawn by an unarmoured half-track. But the anti-tank gun, which is a German Pak 43, the high-velocity 88mm anti-tank gun, was restored by volunteers here at the museum and is now in excellent condition. It wasn't when we got it, it had been standing outside for years. It's pulled in this case by a 12-ton version of the German half-track. The Germans built a whole range of half-tracks up to 18 tons. They were all similar but built by different people. Mercedes-Benz built this version. Powered by a Maybach engine. The front axle undriven, but the track's fully driven. So it's got a drive sprocket at the front, then the typical set of overlapping wheels that you'd see on the tanks as well, but the tracks are of a very special nature. And you can see it there pulling that Pak 43. The Pak was a big anti-tank gun, I mean quite an unwieldy thing for the men to handle when it come off its vehicle, but devastatingly powerful. And one of those in ambush position could knock out any number of tanks before they even knew where it was. But the half-track's quite unusual as well. Belongs to a visitor, so it isn't a member of it, it's not a part of the tank museum collection. It's fitted with a body which was usually designed to carry members of the gun crew and ammunition. So, now he's coming round this way. Again, we can have a good look at him. Notice the way the tracks are going round. It's not always obvious, and this is true of any track vehicle, that the tracks actually on the ground are not moving at all. The vehicle's moving along the tracks. It appears to be the tracks are driving it, but they're not. The tracks are there to provide a pathway for the wheels to follow. And it doesn't look like that, but believe me, that's what's happening. The wheel at the front of the track unit is the driven wheel or drive sprocket, which engages with the track and pulls the vehicle along the track. The wheel at the very back is the adjustable idler, and this is done to adjust the track tension because track stretches. And as it gets slack, you need to take it up, so you adjust the idler. The wheels in the middle, of which there are many and they're all whizzing round, are actually load-carrying wheels, so that altogether they make the complete track, and that's the same for a tank or a half-track, of course. The German half-tracks are really more correctly known as three-quarter tracks because the tracks were really what mattered. The wheels were only there for decoration at the front and a bit of steering, unlike the American vehicle, which relied on its tracks as well. But that's not really a tank, but it's a similar sort of vehicle.